All right. Hello. Welcome to the Centering Equity and Food Policy Councils session. My name is Darriel Harris. I am with Laureen Husband. You want to say hello, Laureen?
Hi, everybody. I am Laureen Husband.
And so we're going to be facilitating the discussion today. The discussion is going to, the way we're going to do it is that after we do the brief introduction of the speakers, we're going to break into two different groups, and then the speakers will give their presentations within the two groups, and then halfway through we'll swap, and so and then the speakers will speak again, and so everybody who is tuned into the session will hear from all the speakers and have an opportunity to ask questions and to get feedback on the topic. And so without any further ado, because I want to maximize our time in the workshops, I want to introduce the speakers, and then I'll give Laureen an opportunity to say a few words. And so our first speaker is LaShauna Austria. So LaShauna is the owner and principal operator of Seeds of Change Consulting and Kindred Seedlings Farm. She possesses a demonstrated record of collaborating with rural communities and both faith-based and secular organizations to address race, land ownership, food justice, and equity issues. Building on her substantial experience in leadership, management, and administrative roles for profit and nonprofit organizations, she has devoted her current professional life to promoting racial equity and building better food systems locally and beyond. LaShauna is also a co-leader of the Alamance Food Collaborative. As the founder and principal of Seeds of Change Consulting, LaShauna provides race equity consulting with a focus on the food system, strategy for supporting the growth of farmers of color, organization and leadership development, research, evaluation, feasibility studies, and so many more things. She is born and raised in rural Alamance County, North Carolina. And she's passionate about rural life, preserving farmland and natural resources and Southern foodways. Our next speaker is Sydney Daigle of Prince George's County Food Equity Council. Sydney directs the work of the Prince George's County Food Equity Council and provides equity, diversity, and inclusion training to state and local level public health focused coalitions through the Institute of Public Health Innovation. For the past 8 years, Sydney has worked with FEC, a local independent policy council. She has over a decade of experience working with systems level public health interventions and local food and farm advocacy. She once served as the South Carolina Department of Education's Farm to School and Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Program Coordinator, and as a sustainability coordinator of the St. Francis Hospital in Greenville, South Carolina. She has worked successfully with diverse audiences, ranging from school cafeteria staff to policymakers to affect change in institutional, municipal, county, and state levels. Sydney also serves multiple advisory and steering committees in Prince George's County, Maryland, including the Health Department Healthcare Action Coalition, Work Group, Prince George's County Corner Store Steering Committee, and Greater Riverdale Cares Coalition Food Access Steering Committee. Next is going to be Kristin Schwab from the Philadelphia Food Policy Council Advisory. Kristin is the Food Policy Council Interim Manager at the Office of Sustainability in Philadelphia. She manages FPAC's equity-focused strategic planning process and oversees the council's meeting and general operations. She previously held roles as facilitator and training with the Anti-Oppression Resource and Training Alliance, co-op organizer for the Philadelphia area Co-op Alliance 20 Books Club, 20 Cooperative Businesses Program, co-founder of Philadelphia Assembled Kitchen, and director of Youth Empowerment Program at the Urban Nutrition Initiative in West Philadelphia. Kristin holds a BA in Individualized Studies with a focus in popular education and food sovereignty from Goddard College. When she is not working at FPAC, you can find Kristin cooking food with her friends, family, and neighbors. Nothing brings her more joy than feeding other movements for change and bringing people together around a love-filled meal. And our fourth and final speaker is Marissa Silverberg, and she's from Jefferson County, Colorado, Food Policy Council. And Marissa currently works on addressing barriers to food access in communities across the Denver metro region as part of the Regional Food and Communities Collaborative. Marissa also facilitates the Jefferson County Food Policy Council, a diverse stakeholder collaborative composed of local governments, nonprofit organizations, food and farm businesses, residents, and policymakers. Marissa is a Bloomberg Fellow in Obesity and Food Systems through the American Health Initiative at the Johns Hopkins University, studying for her master's in public health. Prior to working at Jefferson County, Marissa has worked in roles across the food system, including agriculture, institutional procurement, and community development. I just want to pass it on. I want to give an opportunity for Laureen before we break into our sessions to say anything that she may want to share.
I would like to welcome everybody to this session. I used to facilitate the Livable Food Policy Council in Jacksonville, Florida, and I currently work for Feeding Northeast Florida as the Director of Public Policy and Community Engagement. And we're going to be dividing the group into two groups. So the group that's going to be working on projects and policy will go into one room, and one group will remain with Darriel in the main room. And then we'll switch so that everybody will get a chance to hear everybody. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and I welcome you all to a great afternoon. Marissa, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to go first. So for context, in terms of this room, I believe we were asked to speak more to policy and programming around racial equity. And I think the other conversation will be more about governance and structure. In terms of what I will share, however, I think it's hard to kind of separate them for Jefferson County. So I'll probably touch a bit on both. So I'm happy to answer questions on either structure or policy programming. So hi everyone, it's a pleasure to see so many folks who are part of food policy councils nationally. It's really exciting to be here. I am with Jefferson County Food Policy Council. We are based in Jefferson County, Colorado, which is on stolen lands that are where the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes originate. We are to the west of Denver, and this is an area that is a combination of suburban, peri-urban, and rural mountainous communities. So a lot of different geographies. And in terms of demographics, we may be typically there's an assumption about whiteness, a lot of Caucasian folks, but we have a large Latinx population and a lot of refugees and asylee communities as well. The Denver metro area houses a lot of refugee and asylee communities. And so our Food Policy Council originated in 2015 under our health department at the county. I work for the health department to really look at rising rates of young people experiencing obesity, as well as increasing enrollment in SNAP and WIC. And with that, over the years, we had leveraged funding to look at how to better engage community, starting with some grant work that came out about 3 years ago. And in engaging community, we started to really learn that we were just kind of, as many councils are, and in large part because of our structure, working in a way that centered organizations who are a part of community, but maybe was not providing an effective space for community members most impacted by the issues around food systems, whether food insecurity, farm workers, farmers, et cetera. And so over time, we started to enhance that engagement and start to look at some aspects of what more community-centered leadership in the council would be. And like many other councils, I would say during the COVID-19 pandemic, with a lot of police brutality towards Black men and women in the US, we started to recognize that we needed to do more in this area. We were really not holding an effective structure in the way that we wanted to, and not building or framing our work around shared values of racial equity and leveraging leadership of BIPOC community members. Another touch point for us in kind of recognizing the need to do this work was every year we take the Johns Hopkins Food Policy Council assessment, which I highly recommend. It is pretty lengthy, so we have a shortened version of it just because we originally took it in a smaller group, but realized we wanted to give the opportunity to everyone to take it. And so we got some really incredible feedback in a way that I think, as a white woman, I recognize that a lot of times within white culture, we don't come to a place where we accept criticism well about our whiteness. And I think we received anonymous feedback about not being a space welcoming of BIPOC community members. And I think seeing that was really impactful. And one, it's horrible to know that, but two, on the opposite end, it's so important. And I so appreciate folks who shared that, because that really spearheaded a lot of this work for us to know that it was a problem and to be able to say we need to address this. To that end, on the other side of things, when you look at questions on the survey about diversity, we got a lot of feedback that we're very diverse. So we kind of came to this realization of, well, we have folks who understand what we need to do to get to this place, but we also have folks that are not there. And how do we educate folks while also actually taking action? So that's where we kind of spearheaded two tracks in this, how do we build out a structure that centers BIPOC leadership and really looks at shared leadership with community most impacted by these issues? And then how do we simultaneously better educate and start to actually take action in some of these areas around racial inequities in Jefferson County? So we launched a subcommittee that is actively working on two projects, one of which is a policy toolkit. So this is still a bit in draft form, but happy to share, where we, in looking at policies that we aim to support. So let's say, trying to think of an example. Let's say like there's a housing policy at the state that we want to support, like utilizing this tool to figure out does it align with our shared values and racial equity? And are there recommendations that we should be making around that in terms of utilizing this tool? So really utilizing the tool to figure out, should we sign on or support certain bills? And can we send recommendations to other folks around that? I think a big practice that we have implemented over COVID as well is around centering language justice. So all of our meetings and materials are in English and Spanish, including policies. So we request from partners now, when they ask us to sign on to a policy, that it be available in Spanish, so that for folks who want to speak from their language of the heart, if that is not English, they are able to access those materials. I think that's something a lot of us hadn't realized until during the pandemic, even thinking about like federal policies and SNAP, and how none of those changes to programs are available in other languages. The other project we're actively working on is a history project, which is really looking at the history of our county. So for folks who are unfamiliar, the KKK had a very large presence in the Denver metro area. They were very influential in a lot of policy. And so we're doing a lot of review of federal policy as well as local policy. We're also looking at flat maps in terms of like covenants that were written in our county in terms of discriminatory housing practices, in terms of like certain communities not being able to reside in certain locations, and looking if there's any relation to where there's worse food access. And as well as poor health outcomes, issues around income, housing, and such. And we'll be combining some storytelling with that as well, and kind of engaging on the ground with folks in their lived experience. So that project's still down the pathway as well as we're building it out. Happy to share those additional resources. And we have a racial equity statement I'll put in the chat as well. And then just in terms of governance briefly, so we went through some strategic planning that really actually also recognized our role in government. So we're also kind of looking at what our structure on that end is looking like, and exploring options about what would it look like to shift out of government, just because of the harms that have been created in that sense. And I feel like I went over, so I'm gonna be mindful and stop talking because I'd much rather open it up.
You still have 3 minutes.
Oh, it's like, well, you don't want to hear your own voice. So you're like,
Good.
oh, I'm like so self-conscious, I'm gonna go over. And so I would just add, additionally, one piece I forgot to mention is we have also had a lot of trainings. I think one thing that I found hugely important is, I know, and I feel like other folks may feel similarly, we have a lot of opportunities around racial equity or health equity trainings, but they're kind of these one-off events that are really disconnected in terms of like, what's the next step? What's the action? So we hired Florette King of Thriving Inclusion. She is amazing. If anyone is ever looking for, she's based in Denver, Colorado, but for anyone ever looking for support in this area, we did a series of trainings with our Food Policy Council specifically to talk about history of oppression, structural racism within the food system, and then applying that into action. So looking at how these policies, in particular, looking at policy, how policies have impacted communities of color, and how we can start to build more equitable policies, and also recognize that in policy and practice. So like in talking about the policy tool, we also applied certain policies in group settings to that tool to test it out and see. I mean, all of our tools are living tools, so up for edits, and I would say like happy to share that out. And if other folks and other councils have edits, we're super open and encouraged by any feedback. And I think we got a lot of really helpful comments on that as well, in terms of just what information is needed and making sure that we have certain information available about certain policies, like who gets to be at the decision-making table when a state policy gets selected and there's the rulemaking process. How can we share more out about not just like checking off the box of like the policy passed, we're done. Like there's all these other processes that folks aren't familiar with, and just being like mindful of those pieces as well. And I'll just end by saying, I mean, when I speak about a lot of this, it sounds so much easier said than done. And it has been really challenging. I think really being mindful, especially as a white woman, like I will always have just a level of ignorance that I recognize because of my privilege, I may not recognize. And I think just being mindful of our community and wanting to do better and build trust, but also recognizing, I mean, we have times where we definitely break trust with community because of the bureaucracy of local government. And we are committed to acknowledging those harms and figuring out how to move forward if community members are willing to move. I mean, we just have a community that's so resilient that I'm so grateful for. And just being mindful, like, this isn't an easy practice, but I think if it was, we would all not be here. So I think a lot of folks on this conversation can empathize with the challenges ahead. And I think just recognizing that it's the right thing to do, and it's a human rights based approach of wanting the right to food for all community members in an equitable way.
Thank you so much, Marissa. So if y'all would please hold on to your questions until we have Sydney speak, and then we will all engage in a dialogue together. Sydney?
Thanks, Laureen, and thanks for that presentation, Marissa. I'm very also curious, as was the folks in the chat, about your shortened research for the toolkit from Food Policy Networks, because it is a really handy toolkit, but very time consuming. So I'm here from Prince George's County. For those of you who aren't familiar with the county, we're directly to the right of DC. We're a very populous county, just short of 1 million residents. And we are known nationally and certainly locally as like a real vibrant majority minority county. We're the wealthiest in the country. It's really a seat, I would say, of like Black intellectual life and culture and art in Prince George's. So we're, it's just a very diverse county as far as the demographics go, but also geography wise, we have really urban areas, more suburban areas, and rural farmland. So it's a really rich place to work and to live. I want to talk a little bit about the history of our county as far as like agriculture goes, because I'm taking a slightly different tact and kind of talking about our history working on urban farm policy in the county and kind of how that's evolved, and how we tried to historically embed a racial equity lens into our work, and kind of how we're looking back and looking forward with that lens in mind. But I think it's really important whenever we talk about agriculture anywhere to really talk about context and history. Prince George's County is on stolen land from the Conoy Indian tribe. The Piscataway tribe has lived in this area for upwards of 20,000 years. We still have tribal members who are living in the county and fighting for federal recognition. And agriculture is part of the reason why so many tribal members were displaced from Prince George's. We were one of the largest tobacco growing areas in our region. We also had the highest number of enslaved African laborers of any other kind of area in Maryland. So the history of agriculture in Prince George's County is very much a history of oppression and of displacement. And it's a familiar story for anyone who works in the South or in the Mid-Atlantic, but it's a story that is worth telling again and again. And it's essential to recognize the injustices that gave us the food landscape that we have today in Prince George's. So I told you that Prince George's is a wealthy, majority Black community. It's also not relatively wealthy compared to the rest of the DC metro region. And I think that's really important to highlight. So we have a lot of affordable housing in the county, which is great, but that's also because housing values in the county are depressed compared to the rest of our region. We don't have the same sort of food retail. We don't have the same number of white tablecloth restaurants that you do have in the rest of the DC metro region. So Prince George's, although it's like an incredibly resilient and beautiful place to live and work, is also a place that has not been immune to historic disinvestment and the results of redlining. And that's shown up again and again in our food landscape. Okay, all that to say, we brought this to mind whenever we decided, when we launched, I think 9 years ago now, to work on urban farm policy. This was at the front of our mind. We launched with a really strong commitment to racial equity. And so that's always been part of our mission. That's always been part of our guiding values. And that was part of our thinking whenever we entered into this space of urban farming. So I'm going to kind of take you guys back and talk about our journey. I really look forward to the discussion. I really look forward to learning from you. So when we embarked on urban farm policy in the county, there was only one legal urban farm. It was a nonprofit. And a lot of people were interested in urban farming. And we knew a lot of our urban farms were operating, but we're operating in a legal gray zone, particularly in our we have a lot of immigrant communities in the county. We knew of a few of our neighbors who are immigrant farmers who were farming, growing really important cultural foods for their community, for their neighbors, but were very much at risk of getting shut down. Because they didn't have the regulatory environment that made their work and their contributions legal. So that was happening. We wanted to bring those folks into the light, if you will, make them legal. We also knew that there were a lot of residents who, because we do live in kind of a wealthy area, who had great government jobs, retired, wanted to start a hobby farm to kind of place make, bring green spaces to their community, connect with their neighbors, connect, their neighbor kids to their food source. So there was that desire, and that wasn't possible to do with our current, regulatory environment that we were dealing with. Finally, we were very much supportive and always have been supportive of supporting entrepreneurial opportunities for small food businesses and small food producers. So for a lot of urban farmers, this is a side hustle. It's a way for them to make extra money. We think that's great, and we wanted to make sure that that was possible. So we started convening urban farmers and would-be urban farmers really early on. We had focus groups, conversations one-on-one through our networks, and we asked what the barriers were. And we heard, barriers that I think will resonate probably across the country, across, your relative geographies as well. We heard there were inequities to land access, and this is certainly true in many communities of color across the country. Whenever you don't have the same capital, available to you in your communities, whenever you don't have the same level of intergenerational wealth as some wealthier white communities do, it's harder to get access to land. And that was the case in Prince George's for many people. We also knew that farmers wanted access to networks and to support. So they wanted to talk to somebody else who'd gone through the same thing, ask their questions, maybe have someone to hold their hand, walk them through the process. And that access to support wasn't available. We also heard that people needed access to finances and to, kind of starting capital to get their urban farm rolling, which was understandable, especially for folks who were not doing this as a hobby, but were kind of more in our side hustle group of things. So after we kind of initially organized and got our house in order, if you will, felt like we understood the issues, we had our advocates identified, our partners ready to go, we started pitching to council members that we wanted to work on urban farm policy. And no one bit, no one was interested until one summer, one of the council members brought on a summer intern who wanted to create a bill around urban agriculture property tax credit. This made no sense because we weren't allowed to have urban farms in the county. We had one legal urban farm. It was a nonprofit. It couldn't take advantage of the property tax credit. But we said, what the heck, fine. It's an opportunity to talk about why this is an important issue. We're going to go ahead and go all in. And we did. And we were able to talk up urban farming. We were able to get our advocates excited. And shortly after that was passed, we started moving forward on a urban farm policy to expand, urban farming in the county, allow it to operate in different places. And although we had a lot of resistance from council, because in part, council didn't want to see itself as an agricultural place, as the county's an agricultural place where agriculture is happening in urban areas. It kind of had a negative connotation for them. So there was a lot of pushback, and we ended up having the scope of the bill cut back significantly, but we still got it passed. And that was in part because we brought a really strong and diverse coalition of urban farmers to the table. So we had folks who were involved, in everything from advocating, from reaching out to their council members, showing up at committee hearings, working on the text amendments to the bills, in the rooms with our permitting agency. Because of that, I think council saw there was widespread support and we were able to get it moved forward. So after that launch, we really started to work on building up the networks of support that folks said they really needed to be successful. So we launched a collaborative of county agencies, nonprofits, groups like our Food Council to provide wraparound services to urban farmers who were getting started in Prince George's. We know that it's a huge barrier to navigate the bureaucracy that is county government, to go and take all your time to figure out what the complex web of nonprofits offering services is. And we wanted to take away that time barrier from people. So we tried to create this one-stop shop where folks could go get support and be kind of moved through the process of starting an urban farm with a kind of ombudsman, if you will. So we found, very soon after launching the collaborative, volunteer support was not enough. And we really needed some full-time staff embedded in county government to really support these urban farmers that were getting started. So we were able to write grants to get some part-time staffing in. That was really successful. So we then moved our advocacy focus to getting full-time staff members embedded through the county budget. So we have a full-time staff member to work with urban farmers, and she's been able to really support standing up the sort of, communications networks that people need and people were asking for. So we have like a Facebook group, we have, the Google groups, and then we have like a monthly open mic night where urban farmers can gather, give support to each other, talk about what's going well, what's going poorly. And it's really critical because that's also a place that we can go and leverage the power of our urban farmers and say, what's your advocacy ask, and then support them and make sure they're engaged throughout that process. So it's a really critical feedback loop for us to make sure implementation is going according to how the advocates want it to go and according to their original vision for our policy work. So that all started 6 or 7 years ago. We've been busy ever since. And now we're working on things like launching an incubator farm on park and planning land to really start to address the land access challenges that we know we have in a very expensive region. So we will have urban farmers who come out of nonprofit training programs be able to graduate onto land, publicly owned land for either a very small fee or for free and farm on public land. And then after that, we're trying to identify other parkland to have them graduate to so that they're able to grow their business without the same sort of intensive support that you need initially when you're getting started. Likewise, we're working on a land database so that we can map county-owned vacant properties or underutilized properties across the county, and again, connect urban farmers and community gardeners to those parcels so that there's some access that you can have to start your farm without incurring massive amounts of debt or having to qualify for a really challenging high-interest loan. And finally, just to kind of show that part of this work is just being responsive to what folks want and what folks need. We're working on chicken policy. We heard from a lot of our farmers that chickens provide eggs and eggs provide a nice little source of profit. So they really wanted chickens on their urban farms, and we're about to launch into that fight during this fall session, which is going to be a fight because let me tell you, you would not believe the pushback we've gotten from chickens on urban farms in the past. So that's what we've done. That's kind of how I wanted to talk a little bit about how we've started to embed some strategies to address racial equity through, I think, a policy that a lot of people have worked on and are interested in. But yeah, just to recap, we kept showing up, which was really critical, I think, in supporting our urban farmers and making sure like racial equity is a part of our urban ag agenda. We tried to spotlight whenever we could the experiences of farmers of color and immigrant farmers whenever we did tours to talk about urban farming or to inform our policymakers or planning staff members. We tried to bring them out to farms owned by immigrant farmers in the county. We tried to bring them out to the community gardens where we had a lot of refugee gardeners. And we really tried to make sure that policy crafted spoke to the needs of folks with that were in the most under-resourced communities in the county, so that we didn't have barriers coming out in the drafting process that just were insurmountable for folks to where they couldn't participate in the urban farm policy and kind of fruits of those labors later on. We were adaptive, and we just kind of went where the policies needed to go. So, we worked on everything from this urban farm bell policy. We worked on the zoning ordinance rewrite and tried to incorporate urban farming there. We did so many revisions to that first urban farm policy, and we're going to keep doing more. So yeah, that's kind of how we've tried to address stuff over the years, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Sydney. That was great. I'm going to open it up now for questions. Before I do that, Rachel, how many minutes do we have left?
About 17.
Okay, so we have 17 minutes for our discussion. What time do we end? Is it at 5 or 5:30?
The overall session is at
Yeah.
5:30 Eastern time, 4:30 Central time.
Okay, I thought it was at 5, but I was wrong. I'm glad I was wrong because I was freaking out. So do y'all have any questions? I'm sure you do. I saw several. So Brennan, you had a question. Please unmute yourself to speak.
I need to do that. Hold on. Sorry.
Sorry.
And now unmute yourself to speak.
Okay. Sorry about
Brennan,
that.
are you still with us?
Yes, sorry about that. I was just going to ask about, I thought there was some type of a breakout room I might have missed earlier, and I didn't know what they were focused on. I joined a little bit late, so I didn't know what I missed, if there was a breakout room earlier. That's all. That's all I was going to ask about.
Oh, you're good. We are in 2 rooms, and we're going to switch over to the other room in a little bit. Or the speakers will switch, you will stay.
Okay, I understand.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
you're good. I saw there was a question about staffing. Do you have, Marissa, do you have paid staffing?
So our staffing is we do have paid staffing. However, we don't have any county allocated funds. That's something that we've been trying to work on for several years now. And so we are only grant funded, which has been fairly problematic, just in that it's a lot of specific requirements, specific asks. So it's not like we have a full-time person that's able to dedicate the time to the Food Policy Council. So I would say, I was trying to like put numbers together in my head, but it's probably somewhere between like 10 to 20% of my time. And then I have part-time support on the racial equity group, which probably is like hourly part-time staff person and a few hours a month.
Okay. And Sydney?
Yeah, so I would say our staffing structure has really evolved very, in the past year and a half with, the onset of COVID. We get a lot more funding for our work, which I think is something a lot of food councils are currently having happen. So we have, a full-time staff member, that's me, and then we have a number of contractors that work with us as well, from anywhere from like 35 hours a week, so almost full-time, to 15 to 20 hours a week. And then we have 2 interns about 20 hours a week each. And we pay everybody. The interns are stipended.
Okay. So I have a question. In terms of your FPC structures, do you recognize, I know first you started with history, and it kind of reminded me of this whole national discussion we've been having about critical race theory and the importance of understanding history of a community and a people in order to craft what moving forward looks like. And my question to you is, how was that received by your FPC and your community in general as you're delving into this history that most of us want to avoid that ever happened?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. So we've been kind of talking about these questions for I want to say like really critically about the last 5 years or so. And whenever we really started talking about how racism shows up in agriculture in particular, it created a wedge in our council. We had some older white farmers that, were really resistant to talking about systemic racism. We talked about how racism shows up in policy, and there was definitely this perspective that policies can't perpetuate racism. We talked a lot about how that happens and why that is. And we hosted folks to come talk about their experience working in the county. I think folks did raise on a panel some really painful experiences of interpersonal racism they'd seen happen. And then we talked about more of the system stuff. We had a panel talking about how racism shows up in the Farm Bill, just to really hammer home to our members that yes, like policies can perpetuate racism. They do perpetuate racism, as do institutions. And some members ended up leaving. They ended up not feeling that it was a good values alignment, but we were really clear about what our values were. What the core beliefs were for the council, and what our role was with policy, and part of that we still feel, and we've always felt, is to advance racial justice. So I don't know if that answers your question, Laureen, but it led to some challenging discussions, and it's discussions that we probably should have had a lot earlier.
Thank you, Marissa. I know I was surprised when we first talked about Colorado, because that's not an issue that, we always think as Colorado as being this ultra, not conservative for sure, but liberal. And to start thinking about how do you talk about race and policies and racial injustice in the food system, and how to first understand the story of your county in order to move the policies forward, and how that was received.
Yeah, so I would say, I was laughing a little to myself because I'm like, okay, it's recorded, so be be cautious about how you speak about it, because I think we did get a fair amount of pushback from certain white community members. We are a purple county. We are definitely in a primarily white community. There's a lot of tension there. I think there is a fair amount of folks who are really devoted to addressing food insecurity, but struggle with a culture of white supremacy in many aspects of just white savior complex, needing to be centered in the work, not being receptive to criticism, needing to, why can't we act quicker? Like this rush, we have to do something, even if it's leaving people behind. And of course, folks who are always left behind in BIPOC communities. And so I think one thing we did, I'm happy to post this as well, for our racial equity subcommittee, we did an assessment of members and required that people put their name just to understand their understanding of racial equity, in acknowledging that we also got a lot of pushback about asking people to put their name, which I think is very telling, because we weren't trying to target white community members and say, we want to call you out because you don't understand something. It was, no, we need to sit in this and we need to understand it so that we can move forward. So I think that was definitely a big challenge. But I think also, to Sydney's point, we identify as a council that these are our shared values, and I anticipate we may have folks leave along the way, but this is the right thing to do, and we can't just walk around it and say it's okay, because this is what needs to happen. And we recognize that communities have been left behind and are not being supported in the ways that they need it. So what good is the work if we're not actually addressing the needs of community most impacted?
Okay, Keith, you have a question?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, my name's Keith Carr, and I'm in Brooklyn, New York. I work for a large food bank here, but that's not about my question. A lot of my work has been really trying to draw a connection between urban agriculture as a way to alleviate the need on emergency food, and having, food pantries being adopted by community gardens. and had, some success in that, not as much as that we would like, but I mean, the work continues. But I guess, Sydney, I just appreciated what you were saying about your experience. But one of the biggest challenges to the racial equity in urban agriculture here is gentrification, and then the whole colonization attempts, I'll say, for community gardens. Gentrifiers move to a community where the garden has been there for years, and then try to usurp the long living and long-standing history of that garden, and try to take the gardens over, or I mean, the similar, I'm sure people from around the country have heard about like rent stabilization apartments in New York, and people literally being killed so someone can take their apartments. Hopefully that's not going to happen with a community garden, but I mean, just people waiting for people to get too old to work, and then not really trying to get, people native to that community to take the gardens over. So have you had that experience? And if so, what possible solutions could you offer? Or and then also I've also seen on the positive side a lot of white allies who are saying, like, trying to take a back seat and not be at the forefront of a garden, and trying to really encourage other people to step up. So just want to hear your perspective.
Yeah, that's sad. And especially the rent stabilized apartments, I had not heard that, and that's horrifying. But we haven't yet had an issue with urban agriculture and gentrification in the county, but I anticipate we will. So I think a major blind spot of our work is that we haven't worked on housing affordability and urban agriculture policy in tandem. And that's something that we, is, I think, really essential moving forward, as the county starts to see its property values rising, and as we're having like more of an influx of, frankly, like wealthier white people moving in. So I think that's something we have to keep in mind moving forward. I will say, with the current way that urban farming is happening in Prince George's, it's a lot of stuff in people's backyard, so it's like someone might be a homeowner and they're farming in their backyard, they own the land. It's not so much these kind of glitzy urban farms that you might see, say, in like DC. We don't have the rooftop farming yet, but we've opened up the door to that with our policy work. So that's gonna happen. It's just inevitable, and we really need to prepare for it. So I wish I had strategies to share. I don't. One thing I will say is, with our incubator farm, we're really trying to ensure that those plots go to BIPOC farmers, and farmers who may not have a lot of capital coming into their urban farming journey. So we partnered with a nonprofit that provides training to urban farmers, really is focused really on BIPOC farmers as their kind of cadre of urban farmers that they're training, and they're the ones that are going to be graduating people onto the plots. Next up, we want to look at the leases for park and planning land and see how we can incorporate more like equity guidance into how those leases are made, so that public lands leased to farmers can really look at farmers who haven't had the same level of resource historically to rely on. So thanks, Keith, and I wish I had more to share, but I'd love to hear what you're working on.
Laureen, let's go with Lisa first, because she's had a question, and then I will have you speak next, if you don't mind. Lisa DeSantis.
Hi, good morning and afternoon, everybody. I'm calling from Hawaii Island, and my question was about how we here on Island are facing a similar tension. We shared an Examining Whiteness in the Food Systems webinar with our it's not a food policy council, it's an alliance with our Food Alliance last week or 2 weeks ago. And we received a small but very vocal, very passionate minority of responses back. And I'm just really interested in hearing more about how you pushed through, and both as a council, but also personally, because like those messages all like went directly to my phone, which is, it felt very personal, right? So like, how did you like disassociate yourself between those really passionate messages and that really passionate pushback? And then how did your councils sort of navigate that, right? Like, I understand that some people, I don't want to say are going to be left behind because they're going to choose to leave. But just like I'm blabbering now, but like how do you sort of manage both on both levels? Thank you.
Great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. And sadly, I think part of it is, at least on my end, I think on a personal, I'm kind of used to that. So I started as an organizer actually in New York. And actually at some point, Keith, my whole like start into food was because a community garden was demolished. That is where the Coney Island Amphitheater is now. And it opened up and like I went into food systems. Like it was so that whole experience was so traumatizing for that community. And I think about that community every day. So I think part of it was just my own background. I think part of it was during COVID, like I work for a health department. So we were already getting the personal attacks from masking, from everything. People were looking up our personal information online that I didn't even know. So I think like, I hate to say it, but I think part of it was, and this is not healthy, but just like being really like, this is what justice looks like. This is how we need to push through because this is what matters. And I think it would be one thing maybe if it was something that, I don't know. I just think it's so naturally like, this is justice. This is why we do the work. This is what we need to do, that it really, for me at least, tones out those voices of, okay, well, let me try and reshape this and try and build your understanding. But there is a point of like, you're not going to get it. I think a big recommendation I have though is we really started to build allyship amongst folks who were really dedicated for supporting this type of work. So making sure that, you check in with those colleagues. You also are there to stand up for each other in public spaces. You're going to connect with one another and have that support. I think just having that intention as a collective is so impactful because I think it's just recognizing like, one, I think like as a white person, I recognize like the privilege of being able to take a step back. If I was a woman of color, I would not have that privilege of taking a step back. That's my lived experience. But I think to that end, still like knowing that there is a community in support of this and a community that's willing to have your back and build that allyship, I think has really pushed the work stronger, where we started to notice more folks were speaking out in meetings, even not in our space. So in other community meetings, like, why don't you have translation? We have Spanish speaking community members, or even in their own organizations where we've seen that positive change where they've hired bilingual staff or have started to commit to culturally important foods in the food pantries or things like that. So I think it's had this ripple effect largely because we built that allyship.
All right, so we're going to be switching and you will all get to hear the other two speakers, and we will go and present to the other groups. So we will convene together as a unified group in about 45 minutes. So I'll see you all later.
Thank you so much. I hope you had a great conversation in the first half. We are going to hopefully continue that great conversation in the second half. Our kind of focus is on the internal processes, the internal organizational structures of food policy councils, and we'll be talking about how to things we can do to make them more equitable, the council itself. And so we've already given the introduction for our speakers, LaShauna and Kristin, and I want to give them both an opportunity to share their narrative. I guess I want to keep it as we had it last time, just because usually you get better the second time around. And so I want to allow LaShauna to go first and share a narrative about her food policy council, and then Kristin will go second.
Ooh, I don't know about that getting better the second time around, but hey, everybody, it's good to be I feel like this is speed dating, and I'm a little bit too old for that, y'all. Like this whole, I feel like I gave it all the last section group of folks, and now I need a sip of water. Hey everybody, it's good to see those of you who are on camera. I love to see your faces. The last session, we called folks, we called it their Hollywood Squares. So hopefully you are feeling fine in Hollywood. I'm LaShauna, situated in Burlington, North Carolina, my hometown, all my 40-something years of my life. And I'm on the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation land territory here in North Carolina. And I'm learning every day from my elders in the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation. I'm learning every day to grow food and be a good steward at my farm. We'll talk a little bit about Elements Food Collaborative, and I really might have to take a break to get some water, but I'm gonna try to keep it going. Alamance Food Collaborative, I'm situated here. Alamance County is in Burlington. Yeah, shout out to North Carolina. Come on through. I see you, cousin. And we, I became a part of this group just sort of as a visitor, not a member at all. I didn't say this in the last group, but I wasn't a member at the beginning. I just came in as a visitor, community member, someone who's a lover of food, came to this meeting that happened to be situated at this restaurant, walked in the door, all around the table, white folks. Drinking coffee, sipping tea, eating bagels and donuts. And this was what I walked into. When I walked in the room, I looked around, intentionally looked around. I was likely dressed the way I'm dressed now with my hair wrapped up. I usually do that. And I said, oh my, there ain't no Black folk in here. What is going on? And so I continued to come. I was invited by a white friend, female friend of mine that I love dearly. We were starting to do some organizing work in the community. She's like, oh, you need to come to this food meeting. And so I left the meeting and I said, honey, where are the Black folks at? And then she said, just keep coming. We're going to get this thing right. We're going to do it right. We're going to do it right. And I kept on, thinking that we would. And so I came back. And then eventually I said, listen, this ain't right. I don't see anybody that looks like me. We need to have a different conversation about who's at the table, who's being invited to the table, and why in God's name are we meeting at this bougie restaurant in the middle of the day when Black folks at work? And those were my words. And so folks, after some conversations and sidebar conversations with a few white women, eventually we did stop what we were doing. And I joined the Food Collaborative around that same time, when the commitment to stopping the work and doing racial equity work came up. That's really when I said, okay, I can give you, I can continue to come to this conversation. And so we did a whole lot of stuff, y'all. By then, we started a farmer's market in a Black community that Black folks didn't ask for. By then, we had branding going on, folks putting up stickers in their restaurants and their places of employment around this brand that the Food Collaborative had started. And again, without really any people of color around the table at all. And so we partnered with, and Darriel, give me the 3-minute warning in the chat box. We partnered with a local group in North Carolina called Community Food Strategies, and it's out of NC State. And we knew they were doing racial equity work in the food system. We knew they could offer a training. We've been in partnership with them before. And so we began to have a conversation with Community Food Strategies and said, look, we got a white mess going on in our community and we really need some help. And so at this point, I became like one of the co-facilitators of the group, having some conversations. Thank you. I see the 5 minutes. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with Charlotte Amons. You should look her up. She's part of NC State, really brilliant human in our community. And she came in and gave us some training. We realized there was no common language. We didn't know what race meant. We didn't know what racism meant. And we surely didn't know how it showed up in the food system. So she showed up and gave us a couple of days worth of a training and conversation around food and justice and all those things. And that really helped us to ground ourselves in shared understanding. And so when I talk about, when we talk about tools and things that we need to do to really get that racial equity lens, it starts with shared language. It starts with an understanding of what in the world is race. Why do we have that? What is racism? How does it show up? Then we can begin to build upon that knowledge that we have together and start doing some different things. And so then we had that, and we continue to partner with community food strategies. Our partners, also let me back up. When we started talking about race, we also lost some members. In the last group, I said, I just have to keep it real, that talking about race, you're going to lose some folks. Some folks really didn't want to get down with that conversation. Some folks, some of our politicians, elected officials in our community said, no, we're not going to talk about race. Some of our folks over at Extension, no, we're not going to talk about race. And so those who remained said, we want to be dedicated to this work. We want to do this work. And I continue to remind people then, as I do now, that it takes white bodies to do this work as well as people of color, because we've been doing it for a very, very long time and not getting very much progress because no one's listening to us when we're screaming it. But we also need some white voices to have skin in the game to do this work as well. And so our collaborative is situated with partners such as Elon University, which is in our community, other food practitioners such as restaurant owners. We've got 2 dope Black farmers on our food collaborative. I'm one of them. We've got other partners in the community such as Cone Health System, community-based organizations, some nonprofits. We have some folks at the table, and we have shared language, and we're trying to move forward together. We do listening sessions, community voice listening sessions, and we and our shared leadership, myself and another white female shared leaders, she comes from an institutional background with Cone Health, and I'm a community organizer. And certainly we bump heads from time to time, certainly we do, because I'm like, you got to listen to community. And she's like, well, I got to listen to where the funding may be coming from. And so we certainly get down differently, but together we found that we can do a whole lot of work together when we show up in community, cross racial lines, to do the work, multiracial coalition of folks. And so, we meet monthly. And we realize that not everybody can do that. Not everybody can commit to a monthly meeting. So we don't, we're not penalizing people and, kicking people out of groups and all that. We try our best to decenter whiteness and not show up in a white supremacy culture. So we're not always, checking boxes and doing all those types of things, but we really try to practice relational culture within our coalition. We try to build partnerships outside of North Carolina as well. And so, we'll have Monica White come in and talk to us about her book. Well, I know Malika Keeney from other settings, and we'll have folks just show up, drop a nugget or 2 on us so we can continue to be inspired and continue to be motivated to do the work that we're doing in Alamance County. And that work is all over the place. Again, we've got some school gardens and conversations, not just about kids growing food, but kids growing food that they can then take into the cafeteria that can be cooked and put on their plate. And so we're trying to think about ways to strategize around that and to do that in our community. I got the 1-minute warning. I see you. And then also with over at Elon, thinking about ways that they can use their farm at that property to be a catalyst for conversation around growing food. How can we begin to have the conversation about the lack of Black growers here in Alamance County? And we keep those conversations at the forefront. Also, how do we begin to talk about land trust and land ownership, stewardship in our community in a different way as well? And so lots of things, and I'm out of time. And so I'll get with you in the question and answer section of this, and I'm going to pass it over to Kristin to give her her conversation.
Thank you, LaShauna. Really appreciate it. And I think the second time around, that was good. You know, well done. Hi, everybody. I'm here with you today from Philadelphia, where I've lived for my entire life. My family's lived for generations since we came over during the Irish potato famine. So Philly has a massive space in my heart. And I am a staff member for the Philadelphia Food Policy Advisory Council. We have about 30 members. It's a multiracial cross-class group of members and city staff who work together, about 30 appointed members, about a dozen city staff members who work on food. We're nestled within city government. And, and then we have all sorts of relationships that make us much larger than that. And I say that just to share that I'm, one staff person sharing with you today. I'm not one of our appointed members. I'm one white staff person sharing today. So I'm going to try to strike a balance of the journey our membership has been on collectively, and also the role I play as a white leader in this work to uproot white supremacy and live out our values in our Food Policy Council. So, I'll try to strike that balance in the next 10 minutes or less. So first, just to bring you to Philadelphia with me, I wanted to share our members' words of how they've kind of explained Philadelphia, and then I'll continue with my own. So one, we want to share that Philadelphia is a city that's still, and I'm reading this, so I'll look away for a moment, but Philadelphia is a city that still suffers from the effects of deeply racist policies and practices that began centuries ago with the land theft and genocide of Indigenous people and the enslavement of African people. This history and more recent practices of redlining and mass incarceration of poor and working class communities of color still determines which communities are more likely to experience hunger, suffer from diet-related diseases, labor in our region's kitchens, own land, and have a voice in the political process. This is also a city where for generations, Philadelphia's immigrants, refugees, working people, and people of color have worked to preserve their culture, heal their people, and feed their communities. From growing nourishing foods in backyard gardens and community farms, to serving up breakfast through faith-based and neighborhood centers, Philadelphia's most marginalized communities have provided innovative solutions to our city's food problems. That's a little bit about our city, and it's a little bit about what guides the work of our Food Policy Council. So the FPAC, for short, started in 2011, kind of like LaShauna's. I've only been around for 2 years with the Food Policy Council, but the way it was told to me is that it was a majority white space, started to go on a journey of learning around racism in the food system, and has been multiracial for quite some time. But about 3 years ago or so, the members started to dig a little deeper and think about power and money in our food system, and saw that even though the group had become majority folks of color and was multiracial at this point, that almost everyone that was there advising our city on food policy had a salaried position. Sorry, I just looked over to the chat, had a salaried position in bigger nonprofits and institutions. And the membership was we don't want to operate like that anymore. What feels really important to us is that food policy in our city is led by people who are most impacted by the racist policies I was just talking about, and also people who have really powerful grassroots wisdom from the work that they've done in their communities. So we have been on a strategic planning process, and that's focused on uprooting white supremacy and being a more equitable food policy council. And I want to share a little bit with you about that. So our Food Policy Council has been really focused on shifting our operations towards two goals. One, centering folks who are most impacted and have the wisdom I spoke of, and making sure that those are the folks who really lead our city's food policy. and shifting power and resources from the folks in our city and in our ecosystem who have positional power in the food system, right? So we're looking for, folks who are experiencing food insecurity, are laboring in our restaurants, are growing food for their people to lead our policy, and the folks who are at the big nonprofits that get all the grant funding and the big institutions that are taking up a whole bunch of real estate, not paying taxes in our city, that we still keep them in our ecosystem and we work together to really shift power and resources. So that's what we're striving for. Some of what we've done in the last couple of years, we've done a lot of political education and training, helping folks to understand history of injustices and resistance in the food system, training up our members who are most impacted to be able to lead our meetings. So trainings in like facilitation and other skills that they've identified they want to grow in. We partner with organizations who are led by folks who are most impacted. And pre-COVID, we would host community meals throughout the city that were like co-hosted with these partner organizations. Where city government and our staff team would like pass the food family style, provide compensation and childcare, really make sure we went to where folks are at, as opposed to expecting them to come to some big city building in the middle of town. We started paying our members. Historically, our members were volunteers. We now pay members at a rate that our members decided it together. And we have a process of asking our members. So right now our members are a mix of folks who are most impacted and folks who are, have higher positions of power in like nonprofits and institutions. And we have asked our members with more positional power to opt out of the stipend, and that's on the honor system. So that's a process we've been using for figuring out payment in an equitable way. We have shifted our membership over the years. So we are now majority folks of color, about 75% folks of color in our membership, about 40% poor and working class. So still trying to grapple with that. And we've just changed the way that we do member recruitment and onboarding. And we also try to use our power and position. This is what comes back to me as one of the white staff people. I really use my position to try to push city leaders and also funders in our city. So we've established a food leadership table where I work with other staff to convene leaders from every department that touches food on a monthly basis. And we also push funders like to support our city's urban agriculture plan, which is being led by Black and brown farmers in the city. And what's most important to me is that I also share our challenges and like what we're grappling with, because I want to learn from your all's wisdom. So some of the challenges we're facing is we now have pathways for our advisory council's recommendations to go to city government, but we're really struggling with like implementation and accountability and really making sure that that loop is solid. We're also struggling with the balance of power between city staff and our appointed members. So optimally, our city staff can like do some extra labor that our appointed members are unable to do and are more like bridges than gatekeepers. But we're working within a pretty broken city government system. So would love your wisdom on that. And in terms of our work ahead, and then I'll wrap. One, we're switching to 2 member categories. So appointed members who will vote, which will be folks who are most impacted, and representative members who do not vote, but are held accountable to the work of the Food Policy Council and the recommendations, and really have to figure out how to like transfer power and resources towards our larger goals. And we're also trying to work smarter, not harder. We figured out how to pay members, which is awesome, but folks still have limited capacity. Work like this, despite best intentions, can start to feel extractive or too much of a burden to carry. So striking the balance of just figuring out how to really honor the labor of our members, given, if you're working a full-time job, caring for your family, multiple jobs, whatever the stipend is that you get, there's only so many hours in the day, right? And so our members are just trying to figure out like, where's the best place for them? Where's the best place for our staff? And what's that balance of power that really aligns with our goals? Darriel, I haven't seen any time thing, but that's the gist of what I wanted to share to start. Are we good?
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. I dropped the ball on
No, it's all good.
policing that.
I forgot to ask, but hopefully I didn't go for too long.
No, you're good. I was just about to type 1 minute, but you
Okay,
did good.
good.
You did good. Yeah, the second round, I'll tell you guys, the second time gets better every time. So so there's some questions in our chat box. And so I want to invite everyone, if you have questions for LaShauna and Kristin, please put them into the chat box. And so we can kind of go over the questions one by one. And so I want to invite Laureen Warnock to kind of unmute and ask your question.
I'm sorry, my question was for the last session.
Oh, it was for the last session. I see. Well, I want to ask a question that's kind of similar to that. So LaShauna, you talked about shared language, and you talked about going through a process around developing shared language so you know what race is and what racism is and things of that nature.
Oh.
And so I'm wondering, how easy was it to come to a place of shared language? Because there's 1,000 definitions for racism, and so not everybody's definition is going to be included in the shared, whatever the shared definition comes to. So how easy was it to come to that shared definition? And for Kristin, is there shared language around, within your council around the work, around the ways you describe your work and describe, equity and race and so forth? Do you have shared language?
Yeah. You ask hard questions, Darriel.
No,
It's all good. Yeah, I think I'm trying to think back. I will say that our council, those who remained at the table when we decided that, look, we're going to do some training, that part became easier, because by then the folk who were giving pushback and all that, they weren't coming to the meetings anymore and had decided that racial equity work was not what they wanted to do. So then we enter into this, this partnership with Community Police Strategies. We get this training. We come out with something we can move forward in our meetings with and be reminded of, and we can bring up things about race. And folks don't seem to be, really shifting themselves in their seats or really feeling like they're being attacked and all that kind of thing. So I would say no racial equity work is easy, but after we found the group of folks who were really ready to move forward with the conversation, it became easier to sit together and have really difficult conversations and continue them. So it's not a one and done. You can't take a training and think you're equified, right? You gotta keep on working that muscle. You gotta keep on having those conversations. And so then we start reading books and we start having more deeper conversations together. So yes, it was easier. It was easier after that, and it's always difficult. So I'm hoping I answered that.
Yeah, well, I'm impressed that the people of your council were willing to actually, read the books together. Usually, you may watch a YouTube video together, but folks are not necessarily committed to reading somebody's, philosophical theory around race, food, whatever it is.
Oh yeah, we've actually together we've read The Cooking Gene by Michael Twitty, and Twitty don't play, and it's been really incredible. We've read Monica White, Freedom Farmers, together, and it has been a real beautiful situation that we can really use that book and the language from the books to have our deeper conversations. So
okay, very good.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just add
Sorry.
briefly to that question you raised, Darriel. I think one of the tricky areas for us is the way we get to shared language is through doing trainings and studying alongside one another, like LaShauna just shared. I know every council is different, but for us, We bring on a new cohort of members every year. Our membership right now, we may be changing this, but our membership right now is a 3-year term, and you have the option to continue for 6 years. We bring on new members once a year, right? So one of the things we struggle with is a certain group of people may do the shared learning together. Then we bring on the new cohort, and I think every organization deals with this, right? But like, what do you just keep doing once a year, same old thing? What do you change up? Like, how do you continue to bring more folks into the fold? And then for us, we have 12 meetings a year, monthly. There's also subcommittee meetings. And even that kind of pushes member capacity, like I mentioned. And at those 12 meetings a year, we're trying to strike a balance between political education, like training, like our members want to be trained in how to host community conversations and facilitate meetings, and then also working on policy recommendations that take all that we learn from those community conversations and bring them forward in the city. And we're constantly reimagining what to do with those 12 meetings and what that balance looks like. So it's a little bit.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. Laura McCullough had a question. Is Laura here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, could you ask your question?
Can you hear?
We can hear you.
Yeah. So my question was for Kristin, and it was really around those community meals that you mentioned with the partner organizations. I really like that idea. I can see how that would be very time intensive though. But we're really looking at in our Food Policy Council, I'm over in Douglas County, Kansas, and we're really looking at trying to engage our community in more than just our like formal Food Policy Council meetings that seem very business-like and aren't really approachable by the general public. And so, for me, I'm just really curious, what did the community engagement look like when you did those meals, those community meals? Was it really trying to provide some information about what the Food Policy Council is or what you're doing? Or was it more along the lines of trying to, or maybe it's a combination, also trying to get information for the community about what they see as the needs or their concerns in the community?
Thanks, Laura. The meals I mentioned, the first time we tried that strategy was right before COVID. So the exact meal thing has been paused since. We did it at that moment as part of this strategic planning process. And our membership did some power mapping to figure out what communities we wanted to talk with. And that was like based on race, position in the food system, neighborhood, all sorts of factors. And then we went out to grassroots organizations that are led by folks most impacted in those areas. So like one group was an intergenerational group of Black farmers. Another was like a group of restaurant workers, majority of whom were Latinx and undocumented. So there have been like thinking, and we went to groups that were led by those groups of folks and said, hey, will you co-host with us? And the goal was to share a little bit about the Food Policy Advisory Council and to ask like what the folks at the table would need to share their wisdom with the Food Policy Council. Would they be interested in being members? So it was very much about our operations, like the topic we're talking about now. As our members were engaging in that, we were like, this is also a powerful way for us to do the work we do for policy recommendations, right? And we're about to start kind of incorporating that when COVID hit. So now we've been kind of using a similar like co-partner with an organization. Our members do the facilitation and have conversations when we're doing listening around different policy areas as well. Not quite the same when you can't pass a plate of food around, but I think we're all adapting and looking forward to that moment. It was kind of cool that we brought some city government folks with us, and their job was to strap on an apron and like pass the food and refill the plates. And a lot of people spoke to like that act in and of itself really helped to like change the energy and the power dynamics in the room. So.
Okay, thank you for that. Kristin, if you could just say something briefly about the amount of stipend that you give and how, so that there was a question about how do you compensate people who may be receiving disability and thus, can't receive a lot of, financial gains outside of that. But I want you just to say something really quickly about that, and then I want to give Brennan a chance to answer his question, ask his question.
Yeah, I'll keep it short. We figured out the payment by asking our members what they needed, and that translate it into $1,200 a year for members who just attend those monthly meetings, and $2,400 for folks who are in leadership of our subcommittees or like our facilitation leadership team. I think I told you all I'm in city government. So we laid out all these guidelines for what we wanted to figure out with payment, and we couldn't meet all of them. And yeah, we're doing it where we 1099 folks, and some people opted for getting less than the amount they'd have to report on their taxes. We are working and pushing with the city to do some like direct cash stuff. So we're part of a group like pushing at that, but we haven't been able to meet all of our goals for just getting folks cash that's not tapped into a whole bunch of paperwork. So we're on that journey and welcome other people's wisdom.
Okay, Brennan.
Yes. So my question was, how would you recommend addressing racial equity through social media, and how do you share your efforts with the public in general? Because, and this is all very internal, I kind of wonder how to display the efforts that we're taking with the community, because most of the ways that we're going to interact with people these days, especially, is going to be digital. It's going to be through video chat. It's going to be through Instagram. It doesn't matter where it is. It's probably going to be digital most times. You have to schedule a meeting or a phone call or an email to meet in person, and that's just not as likely nowadays. So can you tell me how you're addressing these things through digital internet means?
Tamika, Kristin. Brennan, can you tell me, is your policy council, are you Black led or BIPOC led?
Yes, we are actually. Mulayli Kennedy is the head of our Indie Food Council here. So it's basically, it's her baby. She's grown it for a long time, and we have gotten to the city county level as of the past year and a half or so. So it's fairly new. This is part of why I really wanted to ask, is because we have to probably shift some things because we're on a government level now. I kind of want to see how this goes, you know.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know that I'm the best person to ask because I'm getting old, and I mean, the speed dating thing is getting me, y'all. So, you know, I don't do a lot of social media. However, what I would say is, if I were talking to a white-led group, I would say, well, you want to avoid unintentional exploitation. You may not think that you're doing that, but you actually may be doing harm by, you know, promoting things and putting Black folks' faces or BIPOC folks' faces out on social media and things like that. So you certainly want consent. And then I think, you know, with the consent of your of what your council is saying, you know, are you wanting to promote what you have already done, as in, hey, look at us, this is what we're doing, or do you want to invite community into something? And I think those are two different things. It could easily be both, but if you're inviting community into something, certainly social media and all those sorts of places are great ways to be able to do that, to, hey, this is what we're up to, come do this thing with us. But if you're using, hey, we're anti-racist coalition of food practitioners as a way to sort of, you know, push that anti-racism lens, then I would think there would be a bigger conversation with your council, getting that consent and understanding exactly what you want to put out there. And then also, if you're dealing with government, that's a whole nother situation, a whole nother layer that, you know, I'm typically free to kind of do my own unapologetic thing, but realizing when you're situated within, you know, a government structure and you're thinking about funding in that way and all that kind of stuff, it can get a little bit more tricky. So I don't really have a good answer, but I would say start with consent, figure out if you're asking community to participate in something, or if you're giving the community information, avoid unintentional exploitation. You don't think you'll do it, but sometimes we put faces of folks on, you know, on the screen, and we don't do them any good by doing that. I'm gonna shut up there. Kristin may have a better answer for you, but thank you for your question.
LaShauna, I think we're about the same age and maybe the same technical abilities. So I don't have much on the social media tip, except I did just put in the chat. we have many of our subcommittees are tied to part of the food system, but we also have a couple that like run our FPACs, like operations. And so our communications and outreach subcommittee just came back from not being around for a minute, so don't look at our webpage. But anyway, they lead our strategy for like communications and outreach. So instead of it being like a staff person deciding, our members decide. So that's something that works. And the other thing I was just gonna mention, we helped to finance our city's urban agriculture plan, which is being led by a really amazing group of Black and brown farmers and growers in the city. And when COVID hit, they were right before they were hosting like big public meetings with like hundreds of folks in them. And they really had to pivot their strategy to still meet folks where they were at, and came up with some really great ideas for just bridging the digital divide, right? Because if you're trying to get like intergenerational folks, you want to have a strong social media presence, like you said, right? But you also want to meet folks who don't know how to get on there. And one of the ideas they had, and I'm not sure if they ended up doing it, but was hiring young people like youth organizers and food work in the city to do like door-to-door passing out of flyers and like being able to do phone interviews with folks and stuff like that. So I guess I would just put a plug for matching your digital strategy with like things that meet folks who aren't on social media as well.
Fantastic. There was a couple of questions in the chat that kind of dealing with the same thing about losing members when you started doing when you started having the conversations around race. And so LaShauna, could you say something about what that process was, and were the people that you lost, were they people of power, or was it like a certain type of people that left, or was it just kind of random?
For sure. Yep. Appreciate that question. Oh yeah, people of power. Folks from let me think. I know a couple of elected officials, so some county commissioners dropped off. We had a person from the local extension office drop off. We had a couple of nonprofit leaders drop off as well. Now, I will say a couple of the nonprofit folks have returned, and the elected officials haven't been invited back. And so I just want to keep it real. There's no need to kind of sugarcoat it. It was messy. And actually, I did a good amount of coaching around, for our council around letting that go, and that wasn't a reflection of whether we're good or bad or anything like that, but it was more a reflection of them being uncomfortable having the conversation about race. And that took a little bit of time, because I think before I joined the council, folks were really deep in, we need to do this work in conjunction with our elected officials, and we really need to do, we've got to have these certain people at the table. And I think over time that shifted, and folks were realizing, actually, we need more community members at the table. Actually, we need more, folks who are, been doing food for a long time, but haven't been in a certified kitchen, but have really been feeding the community in a way that has been life-giving and beautiful. We really need to be able to focus on this work in a different way. And so I think over time, we certainly don't miss those elected officials. We have good partnerships with our local universities, young folks. We have good relationships with Black and brown farmers in our community. We're doing the farmers market. And so that was a challenge. And I think it will continue to be a challenge of who's at the table. And we don't have typical membership either. Like, we don't have terms. We don't, it's really just a grassroots, more community-centered group of folks doing this work together and having these conversations together. So I'm hoping that that helps you out a little bit and know where we're coming from my perspective. Kristin, did you want to add?
I think you hit it. I guess in the last call, I did uplift that at our council, we use race-based caucuses So when there's things that, you know, white folks need to be doing some work, folks of color need to be doing some work, it's very different work emotionally. And in terms of what we need to talk about, that's a tool we use that I would, you know, remind folks is available. And we also do it by position in the food system and like whether you're a community member, you're tied to a big institution or part of city government. So that's all I would offer, is just that's a tool to just give folks space to do some of this work. But yeah, if folks aren't down, you got to let go. Like LaShauna said, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both. I want to allow Umi the opportunity to ask a question.
Yes, thank you. I am in the Mississippi Gulf Coast and Biloxi Sioux Territory, and I find it interesting and just even the overall discussion on the power of food. If you, LaShauna, or anyone rather, has seen a disconnect with those who are interested in consuming living foods, local foods, you know, farm food versus you've grown up on frozen and canned and packaged food, because even the book, The Cooking Gene, I've read, we are still tackling obesity and other health issues. And I think that sometimes we are very focused on food policy, but not necessarily addressing how that is, how that translates to the health and well-being of the community, opening the discussions for what our community needs as far as education and health and wellness. So have you seen a shift or a change in the wellness of the community overall when it comes to farming and living foods?
Oh, that's a question. I appreciate you and appreciate your question. And I'm gonna answer your question, but I need to let y'all know that before I started with the Food Collaborative in my community, folks came into the community, called themselves Assessing the Community, and said these folks need a farmer's market. Started a farmer's market in a Black community, and nobody in the community asked for it. And then quickly found out that you know, they built a shelter, got a grant, all the things, and then they started bringing in farmers for the farmers market because there's no Black farmers or BIPOC farmers in that community. Started bringing in farmers, and then had the audacity to come to the table talking about the local economy. And so folks began to say, what are you talking about, the local economy? You're bringing in farmers who are benefiting from folks shopping here, getting money and resources from this community and taking them away because they don't live here. So what are you doing talking about local economy, right? And so that was like, you know, starting the farmers market is strike number one. Strike number two, you're bringing in white farmers into a Black community, and now you're lining the pockets of white farmers who leave that community and take those resources with them. And so folks began to say, well, why aren't the folks in the community coming to the farmers market? We didn't ask for a farmers market. We're struggling to pay our light bill. We're struggling to keep our kids in school. We got all kinds of crime and things happening on our side of town. We're not coming to the farmers market, right? And so then they begin to say, well, what do you want in your community? So but you know, by now I'm coming in, and other people of color in the community are coming in and saying, look, halt, you shouldn't be doing these things in this community. And so they said, well, what do you want? What do you want in community? We need other kinds of resources in our community. How about Sally Mae been cooking over at the church for 18 years, and we would rather eat Sally Mae's food, right? And so we began to have conversations about what can we actually, how can we be with community that's already doing really brilliant work around food, but not being recognized in the same way. And so folks wanted a variety of foods, right? They didn't want just, you know, kale at the farmer's market, but they wanted things that were familiar to them as well. And so to answer your question, I see we're about to be done. To answer your question, there is some conversation in my community around food is medicine. How can we begin to have a different conversation about food and how food can be accessed in community, and how we can use this as a tool to help with disease and other things that we're seeing, particularly in African-American communities, disproportionately in African-American communities, because we know it's in all communities, right? But disproportionately in African-American communities. And so those conversations are happening, and no, not a lot of change to answer your question. Sorry to be so long-winded.
No, thank you. There's a lot of other questions that haven't had a chance
Yeah.
to be responded to. It looks like the rest of the group is going to be back in 60 seconds. So I apologize for those we weren't able to hear from. But the chat box is still open, so please.
Feel free to hit in the chat, and also I'm just going to drop my contact information because I see a couple of folks ask for it. Feel free to reach out. Feel free to reach out.
Yeah. So I'm waiting for everyone to be here. It looks like everyone's here. Is Laureen here? There she goes.
I'm here.
Hi.
Hello there.
Okay, so if you've been here the whole time, then you've heard from 4 speakers. If you are one of the speakers, then you've only heard from a couple. And so I want to give Laureen a chance to talk about some of the insights that were gathered in the discussion that she moderated.
I recognize, based on our presenters, that this is really difficult work, but it's work that must be done. And one of the things that I heard from both Marissa and Sydney is that we must, as communities working in this space, first seek to understand the history of what's happened to the land and the people before we can start working on initiatives to move the project forward. And, with all the criticism around critical race theory, it brings us back to, we must understand what has happened to spaces and the people who have lived in those spaces, because not to understand it means that we're more likely to make more mistakes into the future. I also heard that people are struggling as they seek to, to have authentic racial justice discussions. Means that there are some people who are going to be uncomfortable. There are people who are going to be angry. There are people who are going to leave your groups, but doesn't mean that it's still not, it still means that it's the right thing to do. And having an understanding of what your principles and values as a group are going to be moving forward is very, very important. And to understand that not everybody will seek to be rowing with you on the same ship or boat, and that's okay.
Wow. It sounds like your discussion wasn't very dissimilar than ours. We had a talk where we talked about, LaShauna mentioned that she was doing this work in rural North Carolina, and they had some elected officials and some extension people who weren't on board with discussions around race. They had an effort to create some shared language. And when they embarked on that journey to form that language, some people didn't want to talk about it, and so they left, and that was okay. They left, and some people have since come back, and others have not been invited back. Some of the elected officials have not been invited back into the group. In ours, one of the things that was clear between with LaShauna and Kristin was that a plethora of voices are needed. And so if you want to do equity work and you want to, if you want to do food policy work, equity needs to be reflected. And if you want to do good food policy work, that means you need a plethora of voices at the table. And so collecting those plethora of voices mean that you have to do some out of the box things, community listening sessions, paying food policy council members, figuring out creative ways to make that funding possible. Because if you're in a city like Philadelphia, like Kristin, then you can't just ask your elected officials are not just going to start, paying people on the council. And so you have to figure out ways to maneuver to make it possible. One of the other things that became crucial, and I touched on it earlier, was to share language. And so You're talking about race, you're talking about racism, you're talking about all these different things. I was pleasantly surprised when LaShauna discussed her council reading books together. And so the books that they read formed the basis of the language that they use, which allowed them to have conversations that were on the same level, and they were kind of speaking on the same concepts that were guided by the books that they read. And she put in a list of it's a good list of, but I think somebody asked in the chat what the reading list was. So if you could give a link to that, or just tell us what the reading list was, then that would be great, great as well. Both of the councils started off, both Philadelphia and rural North Carolina, they started off as majority white. And so Philadelphia has gone through the process of kind of transforming into a council that is more representative of the community. And the North Carolina has kind of done the same. Yeah, and there were so many other insights that I don't, it's hard to kind of summarize them in a few minutes. But Laureen, you look like you have something to add.
Oh, no, I was going to say, if there are any questions that from the collective that we did not touch on that you had, and you would still like for the forum to answer those questions, please put them in the chat, because we're saving the chat and we will be coming back to you sooner or later to answer those questions. I also wanted to ask our presenters, are there insights from the questions that you were asked by the group that you would like to reflect on?
Yes, and if your presenters could take like 2 minutes each to answer that and give your final statements, then we would greatly appreciate it.
LaShauna?
Tell you what, y'all make me go first a lot. I didn't get a sip of water. So what am I reflecting on leaving? I'm reflecting on, honestly, I'm just gonna keep it real, some harm that I just read in the chat box to one of my sisters that was really kind of got me in a funk. Just really sorry about that. I'm leaving here reflecting on what are the strategies, what are the ways that we are able to come to the table together to have meaningful conversations about race and equity, and also be able to keep folks at the table. Where's that language? What's that strategy? And how do we do this work together? Cross-racial lines, multi-generational, multi-ethnic way of doing this work. And so I'm leaving reflecting on that. I'm reflecting on my own work and how I have these conversations in community, and how I can do that better, and how I can be in my community, other communities that I'm serving and working with, to be an example of this work, and also to just really continue to be unapologetic in my approach. I think that telling the truth is the way to get at this work. And I just think that we've organized lies for a very long time, and I want to be an organizer of the truth when it comes to racial justice work everywhere I go. So that's what I'm leaving with and reflecting on. And I appreciate y'all even having me in this space. Speed dating is not my thing, but somehow I was able to hang in there with y'all to do that. And I appreciate the invitation to be with y'all.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing for the truth. And Sydney?
Yeah, I think I'm just reflecting on the role of white allies in food policy councils, and particularly those of us who are, staffers and white, and how we can leverage our privilege better and every day. We had a question come up about nasties that got sent out after I think a racial equity training, or maybe it was like a nasty grams, I meant, after racial equity training, or some reading that a group had done around advancing racial justice in the food system, and how to deal with that. And I think one of my first thoughts was just, how I was thinking back about when similar things happened in my food council and like how, the priority, or at least I still think the priority should be like making sure your members of color don't have to deal with that shit. So like, when that comes up and it's from a white person, I think I would just encourage my white peers who are involved in food policy council work to take that on, to educate that person, and to try to do everything you can to kind of provide an opportunity for them to understand the importance for addressing systemic racism in the food system. And if they can't get there, really have a serious conversation about whether or not their values are aligned with your council, and whether or not it makes sense to move forward together. But yeah, that's I'm just really trying to think about allyship and how I can show up better.
I love that. I'm going to start asking people, are your values aligned with, and just inserting whatever that is. And let's see, Marissa.
Laureen, I knew you were gonna call me, and I was like, mine was so similar to Sydney's.
That's okay.
One quick thing I'll add as well, similar to, I'm excited to dive into your recommendations for reading, LaShauna. We have a subcommittee that meets once a month that we assign particular readings and other media to, and have a discussion around it to build that education throughout the council as well. And so I'm happy to attempt to pull some of those from my emails if I can find them too. I would just say, in reflecting on this, I think just really being mindful of the history as a priority. I know we talked a lot about that, but I think it's been really shocking to me throughout this process how little I knew specific to my area, and knowing more in other communities, but not really knowing the local history of where I am currently working and residing. And I think even to that end, how many white folks who live during these times where they're not familiar with the histories that happened while they lived, I think has been very eerie to me. I think we have a lot more media and trusting information because community can share things on social media now, but there's ups and downs about that. But I do think it builds some more accountability in there. But I think just really recognizing even a lot of white folks who have lived during those times really don't understand or know of histories. And I think it's so important to elevate those. And I'll just second Sydney's point about allyship and being a white ally, and recognizing that we are in a privileged place to step in and out of harmful spaces, being white women, and how can we support our peers of color when it's an actual harm in that respect.
Okay, thank you. And Kristin, where are you? There you are.
I think I'm right here. Can you see me? Yeah, okay. I guess I'm thinking two things. One, it just always hits me, how many people it really takes to affect change. And we've talked a lot about like people leaving food policy councils and whatnot, but to tap into what the two other white folks just shared, like, I think our job is to bring more folks along, right? I mean, some folks got to go, sure, but overall, like, I just want to see our movements for deeply transformative food policy change, like, bigger and stronger. And I want to make sure that we like move from a place of love and like recognize that we're on this journey too, right? We're not like the folks who have arrived and are here to teach other folks, but like, I remember a time growing up where I didn't think about race, and a lot of folks have guided me along the way, and I want to make sure I can bring other folks along. So I guess I just want to call, there was a number of people who asked questions from like entirely white food policy councils, and just want to really encourage everyone to like start the conversations today, move from a place of love, and find your stake in this work so you can't sleep at night until it gets done. Like that's the place we all want to be at. So I wanted to raise that up. And then I also want to make sure that we're really thinking about power and resources. How can we yes, shift who has power and who leads policy change. So it is Black and brown folks and working class folks leading the charge. And like, what are we doing with all the folks that are running our food banks and our nutrition education centers and, you know, still a lot of white folks, but even brown folks with more money, et cetera. Like, what's their and our role in this work, you know? And we talk about at our Food Policy Council, like, what if tomorrow all those big nonprofits in Philly band it together and said, funders, we're not doing anything else to feed anybody until we can pay all of our workers a livable wage so they can feed themselves, right? Like, that would be a big impact.
Yes.
And that's mobilizing all these like white and brown, you know, folks who got salaries running these big behind nonprofits. And like, we got to organize up and we got to move power and resources. So that's another piece that's just, and I think we've all got, you know, a little bit more power than everybody else, maybe a little bit more resources. And I think we really got to use that and mobilize from that place.
Thank you. That was powerful. Darriel?
I agree. I think our time is come to the end. So I just want to thank all of our presenters and thank Laureen and thank all of you for coming out, participating. I hope I read the chat and I hope, and I hope that you're able to get some support from this group.
And also, please remember to reach out to the Food Policy Network, specifically the folks at Johns Hopkins, if you need support. As you can see from the chat, there are so many of us doing this work willing to just jump in and help you if you're struggling in your space, in whatever way you're struggling. And we just want to make the food system better for everybody, not just a select few. And if that means that we need to come to wherever you are, or we need to jump on a Zoom call to support you, we are willing to do that. So please don't do this work alone, but know that we are all here to support you and share our stories of success and failures and continue to move forward. So thank you, everybody, and have a great evening.